Some people do not enter rooms. They absorb them quietly without asking permission. You leave conversations with them feeling tired, slightly irritated, and unsure why your energy disappeared. They did not insult you. They did not argue. They simply talked, performed, hinted, and pulled attention toward themselves. And somehow, without noticing, you gave it freely while thinking you were just being polite, patient, or kind. Attention feels harmless when given, yet strangely expensive when taken repeatedly by the same person. You begin to realize certain individuals never leave interactions without taking something invisible from everyone present. They leave lighter, you leave heavier, and no one openly acknowledges what just happened in the exchange. This is not about loud people. It is about those who subtly make every moment orbit around their presence. What if the exhaustion you feel around them is not emotional, but psychological and deeply patterned? What if they are not just talking, but quietly feeding on something you do not realize you are providing? And what if you have been trained your entire life to offer it without resistance or awareness? Why do some people leave others drained without ever raising their voice? And why does this pattern feel so familiar that you rarely question it until now? Because what happens next will make you see ordinary conversations in a very different way. Imagine a person who joins a group conversation, listens briefly, then slowly redirects every topic back toward their experiences, their stories, their emotions, without anyone clearly noticing the shift. Picture someone who shares small problems repeatedly, not asking for solutions, but ensuring the room stays emotionally focused on them for extended periods of time. Imagine a friend who constantly jokes about their struggles, laughs loudly, and keeps everyone engaged, yet somehow leaves others feeling oddly tired afterward. In each situation, everyone believes they are choosing to listen, choosing to engage, choosing to care, believing they are fully in control of their attention. No one feels forced, no one feels manipulated, and yet the emotional spotlight never leaves the same person for very long. People walk away thinking they had a normal interaction, unaware that most of their mental energy was spent maintaining someone else's emotional presence. This is where the illusion begins, the belief that attention is given consciously, when often it is pulled automatically by subtle behavioral cues. Attention seekers rarely demand focus directly. They create situations where your mind feels responsible for maintaining their emotional comfort. You think you are being supportive, patient, kind, and emotionally intelligent, while your attention is being slowly guided in predictable directions. The mind does not recognize this as manipulation. It recognizes it as social responsibility, which makes the pattern even harder to detect. Because nothing dramatic happens, no conflict, no confrontation, just a steady redirection of collective awareness toward one individual. Over time, this becomes normalized, and you begin to expect certain people to always occupy more emotional space than others. You start adjusting your behavior around them without realizing it, speaking less, listening more, and offering more emotional presence than you intended. This is not accidental, and it is not random. It follows patterns the brain has learned to respond to automatically. And the moment you see these patterns clearly, the sense of control you believed you had over your attention begins to feel incomplete. Because what feels voluntary is often deeply conditioned, and what feels polite is sometimes quietly costly. What this conditioning looks like inside the brain is where the real story begins. If this is already making sense to you, it means you're starting to notice patterns most people never see. Subscribe, and let's keep exploring how the mind really works. Now, this is where things start to get uncomfortable. Imagine a person who constantly interrupts others gently, not rudely, but just enough to redirect the emotional tone of every discussion back toward themselves. They nod while others speak, but their eyes wait for the moment they can reinsert their own story into the conversation again. You do not notice the interruption clearly, because it feels like enthusiasm, engagement, and social warmth rather than quiet control of the room. After spending time with them, you remember very little of what others said, but you remember almost everything about them. This is the first crack in the illusion. Attention is not shared equally. It is subtly centralized without anyone consciously agreeing to it. The mind begins to treat this person as emotionally important, not because they are, but because they constantly re-establish themselves as the focal point. Repetition creates familiarity, And familiarity quietly convinces the brain that something deserves priority over other signals in the environment. You begin to feel responsible for their emotional state, even when they never asked you to feel that responsibility directly. Their tone, expressions, pauses, and storytelling rhythm train your mind to stay alert to them more than anyone else. This is where attention stops being a choice and starts becoming a reflex shaped by repeated exposure to the same behavioral patterns. You think they are expressive, open, relatable, when in reality they are repeatedly anchoring your focus to themselves through predictable cues. This is why you feel drained without understanding why, because your mind has been working harder than you realize to track one person constantly. The emotional weight you carry afterward is not from listening, but from sustained mental monitoring you never intended to perform. And once you recognize this shift, you begin to see how easily attention can be trained without permission. Because the brain does not like loose ends, it prefers to keep checking back on whatever seems emotionally unfinished. And attention seekers are experts at leaving emotional threads slightly open so your mind keeps returning to them. What feels like harmless personality traits are actually signals your brain has learned to prioritize automatically. And this is only the surface of how deeply this pattern has been wired into your social behavior. Because the next layer reveals why your brain not only allows this, but quietly rewards it. Imagine a person who constantly sighs softly before speaking, hinting at emotional weight without fully explaining it, pulling everyone into silent anticipation before they continue talking. They never clearly state their needs, yet their pauses and tones make others feel compelled to fill the emotional gap for them. You find yourself asking if they are okay, offering reassurance, checking in repeatedly, even when nothing obvious has happened. This is not coincidence. This is conditioning happening in real time through repeated emotional cues and predictable responses from the group. Your brain begins to associate their presence with emotional responsibility, creating a habit of monitoring them before you even realize it. The more this pattern repeats, the faster your mind reacts, until it becomes automatic to scan their mood the moment they enter a space. This is how attention becomes tied to emotional vigilance without any conscious agreement from you. If you have noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. The brain is wired to respond quickly to emotional uncertainty because unresolved emotional signals feel like problems that must be monitored. Attention seekers learn, often unconsciously, to present themselves as emotionally unresolved in subtle, continuous ways. They rarely close emotional loops completely. They leave conversations slightly unfinished, feelings slightly hinted, and expressions slightly ambiguous. Your mind interprets this as something that requires ongoing attention, creating a background task that runs quietly whenever they are present. This is why you feel tired around them even when nothing intense has happened. Your brain has been running emotional calculations the entire time. The more empathetic you are, the stronger this conditioning becomes, because empathy makes you more responsive to unresolved emotional signals. You begin to mistake this mental activity for kindness, patience, and emotional maturity, while your energy slowly depletes unnoticed. The brain even starts rewarding this behavior with a sense of social usefulness, making you feel needed when you respond to them. This reward strengthens the cycle, encouraging you to keep offering attention because it feels morally correct and socially appropriate. And this is where the pattern becomes dangerous, because your brain begins to benefit from a dynamic that quietly drains you. Because the next layer reveals the hidden payoff that keeps you participating in this cycle willingly. Imagine a person whose laughter draws the room toward them, not because it is louder, but because it feels socially urgent and irresistibly magnetic in subtle ways. You notice yourself smiling and nodding more than usual, feeling a strange satisfaction simply for being part of their orbit, even when it costs your own focus. Their stories are never fully finished, leaving emotional threads dangling, and your mind instinctively tracks them, feeling useful and attentive as if your awareness itself is valuable. This gives a hidden payoff, not for them, but for you. Your brain interprets engagement as a reward, creating subtle satisfaction for monitoring their behavior continuously. The more energy you invest, the stronger the internal reward, even as your external productivity and emotional reserves quietly diminish in unnoticed ways. It feels almost noble, an act of social vigilance, like your presence stabilizes their world, while your own energy quietly leaks into maintaining the illusion of balance. Your mind begins to crave the interaction, even when the experience is exhausting, because the reward system interprets small social victories as internally gratifying. Even simple acknowledgments like nods, smiles, or brief responses reinforce a sense of purpose, making you unconsciously addicted to their emotional pull without conscious consent. You may even justify your fatigue as empathy, patience, or kindness, never realizing these mental rewards are a subtle manipulation of attention and mental bandwidth. The brain treats the ongoing attention as socially adaptive, rewarding vigilance toward unresolved emotional cues, making the experience feel morally or socially necessary. You begin to defend the cycle, insisting on participating because you feel the payoff is meaningful, unaware that the cost is emotional depletion and mental exhaustion. Even when alone afterward, your mind replays snippets of their behavior, prolonging the invisible mental labor, reinforcing the reward loop that quietly conditions your focus. And yet, this is only half of the story, because the next layer exposes how identity itself becomes intertwined with attention-giving. It is not just about noticing them. It is about who you believe you are when you are paying attention and feeling necessary. This subtle alignment of identity and attention is what traps intelligent, conscientious people into cycles that feel involuntary, yet socially required. The deeper truth is that your brain enjoys the payoff, while your emotional system is slowly drained, creating a tension that feels inexplicable until fully recognized. Because once you see the connection between energy, reward, and attention, you begin to notice patterns repeating in every social environment you inhabit. And the next stage will reveal how this reinforcement eventually becomes part of your very sense of self. Picture someone who constantly mediates arguments, soothing others while remaining emotionally invisible, gaining subtle praise for their role, without realizing they are anchoring their identity to other people's reactions. They start believing that being drained is proof of moral or social worth, equating exhaustion with responsibility and unknowingly shaping who they think they are. This identity begins as small choices, pausing when someone sighs, clarifying vague statements, noticing slight emotional cues, but grows into a defining trait over months and years. Eventually, the person equates constant vigilance with intelligence, kindness, and social maturity, and any attempt to disengage feels morally wrong or socially risky. Their self-image is built around the capacity to notice, absorb, and respond, and this identity quietly justifies ongoing mental and emotional expenditure. If you have noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. The brain prefers consistency, so once identity is tied to attention and emotional monitoring, disengagement creates discomfort that feels like personal failure. Even subtle rest, avoidance, or prioritizing oneself triggers internal resistance because the identity invested in constant vigilance interprets it as neglect or weakness. Every social encounter reinforces this identity, rewarding attention-giving with social approval, while masking the slow depletion of energy as a necessary cost. You begin to preemptively monitor others before they even signal need, because the pattern is no longer conscious. It has become part of how you see yourself. This is why intelligent, socially aware people often feel drained by social interactions even when nothing extreme occurs, because identity itself mandates attentiveness. And awareness alone does not break the pattern, because identity is deeply linked to neural pathways reinforced over time through repeated attention-giving behavior. The more ingrained the identity, the harder it becomes to recognize the subtle extraction of energy as manipulation rather than social virtue. This is the final barrier, where attention-giving, mental vigilance, and social approval are fused into a single, automatic sense of self. And the next section will offer a perspective shift that allows you to observe this pattern without being trapped by it. Imagine standing outside a crowded room, observing the interactions without entering, noticing how attention flows, how energy shifts, and how people silently tug at each other's focus without effort. From this distance, the behaviors that once seemed urgent or manipulative now appear as patterns, predictable and impersonal, revealing a system rather than a personal attack on your attention. You start to see the subtle emotional extraction not as a moral failing of others, but as a reflection of their own unresolved needs, anxieties, and compulsions that drive performance. The room still hums with social tension, but your perspective separates your identity from the currents, allowing observation without involuntary engagement, and awareness becomes the first act of autonomy. Your brain begins to register the distinction between noticing and participating, showing that energy only drains when identification with the stimulus occurs, not from mere awareness of its existence. Even internal reactions, the small spikes of anxiety, irritation, or obligation, can now be seen as signals, not commands, a map of the mind's automatic responses rather than a trap. You recognize that giving attention is a choice, not a duty, and each decision to engage or step back becomes an experiment in observing your own boundaries. Patterns of energy extraction now reveal themselves as neutral, functional, and often unconscious, which reduces their psychological impact, while the focus shifts from others' neediness to self-observation. The quiet realization emerges that these cycles, once emotionally binding, are simply flows of social energy, understandable, predictable, and therefore manageable through perspective rather than effort. The reframe does not create detachment in a cold sense, but a mindful observation that allows mental resources to remain intact, while comprehension deepens the emotional intelligence of presence. You notice that boundaries are not walls but filters, letting engagement happen selectively, and the act of observation alone shifts the energy balance without confrontation or withdrawal. As awareness grows, you realize that social drains are not personal assaults, but stimuli, and you can choose how your mind allocates attention without guilt or compulsion. This shift in perception quietly rewrites the meaning of engagement, showing that energy is only depleted when identification occurs, and observation without reaction preserves both cognition and calm. And the next section explores the subtle inner transformation that happens when this quiet perspective becomes a lived reality. Imagine a morning where you notice a colleague's dramatic display, yet your mind does not tighten, does not react, and energy remains contained, quietly intact while observation continues. The subtle shift occurs over repeated exposure, as the mind practices presence without entanglement, and mental fatigue gradually diminishes while social intelligence deepens. You notice patterns, emotional cues, and energy flows without engaging compulsively, and this silence itself becomes an active process of self-preservation and mental clarity. Small moments, pauses in conversation, refusal to comment on provocations, measured listening, become exercises in maintaining internal balance while still perceiving the full social picture. Each act of non-engagement quietly reinforces neural pathways that decouple identity from obligation, showing the brain that attention is optional, controlled, and self-directed. The world does not change, but your relationship to it does, transforming what once caused internal drain into material for reflection without cost or personal compromise. Awareness allows a calm observation of manipulation, overstatement, or dramatic attention-seeking without absorbing the emotional pressure, preserving cognitive and emotional bandwidth in a subtle, sustained way. Energy, once fragmented by automatic engagement, becomes coherent, focused, and more resilient, while social intelligence improves through careful perception rather than reactive involvement. The quiet shift is not immediate, but incremental, as repeated mental choices establish a foundation of internal authority, allowing presence without surrender, attention without loss, and awareness without fatigue. And the next section will guide the viewer toward the deepest reflection, showing the mirror in which social patterns and self-identity converge. Imagine sitting alone after a long day, replaying conversations in your mind, noticing how energy was drained, how subtle manipulations shifted your attention, yet without judgment or emotional surrender. The mirror reflects not only the behavior of others, but the habitual responses you have carried, the automatic engagement that unknowingly surrendered focus and inner calm repeatedly over time. You realize that much of what felt like social chaos was actually a projection, an externalization of others' insecurities and compulsions, leaving you with a reflection of your own mental patterns. In this reflection, It becomes clear that emotional exhaustion was rarely caused by others directly, but by identification, reaction, and the unconscious compulsion to validate or respond. Every draining interaction now appears as an opportunity to observe your own attention economy, the subtle ways energy was allocated, and the patterns that allowed depletion without awareness. You begin to see that awareness itself is the most profound shield, turning perceived attacks into information and draining encounters into lessons in self-preservation and social intelligence. The mirror does not lie. It shows the neural habits, emotional triggers, and conditioned responses that have shaped your engagement with attention seekers over years. You notice recurring patterns of expectation, imagined responsibility, and internalized obligation that once made interactions exhausting and now appear as neutral observations, ready for mindful navigation. Reflection reveals that power lies not in controlling others, but in the deliberate management of focus, the conscious decision to allocate attention, and the quiet ownership of mental energy. And as this understanding settles, a soft calm emerges, a recognition that social drains exist, but only take what you allow, and the mind can always reclaim what was surrendered. The next section closes this journey with an open loop, inviting continued reflection and leaving space for the mind to integrate the subtle psychological shifts. Imagine stepping into your next conversation with full awareness, noticing the currents of attention, the subtle pulls of dramatics, yet choosing observation and engaging only where energy aligns naturally. This journey is not about avoidance, but the quiet reclamation of self, the deliberate allocation of attention, and the understanding that presence need not mean surrender or emotional depletion. You realize that every encounter carries potential for insight, reflection, and subtle learning, even when the other person seeks only validation, chaos, or attention at the expense of calm. The mind gradually learns that energy is a currency and attention a choice, and the moments that once felt exhausting now become neutral landscapes for careful observation. Quiet observation does not isolate, but strengthens, allowing empathy without enmeshment, awareness without absorption, and presence without compromise of internal equilibrium or cognitive clarity. And as you leave this space of reflection, the psychological loop continues, for each encounter offers a mirror, each interaction an opportunity, and each choice to observe a step toward mastery. This understanding is never final. The mind always returns to reflection, the currents of attention always shift, and the quiet control over self remains a lifelong, evolving process. The journey does not end here, but invites continuous awareness, measured engagement, and the calm understanding that energy can be protected, even amidst the constant pull of attention seekers.